So welcome everybody to the April 24th, 2024 World Court of Human Rights Coalition meeting. Our guest speaker today is Melanie Nathan, and I will introduce her here shortly, but in the chat, I will enter her one of the websites that pertains to the work that she does. For the sake of time, and for anyone who wants to, please put your information in the chat for any particular organization that you may represent, if you'd like to share that. Well, just a brief coalition update. We're going to be interviewing, hasn't happened yet, but we do have some applicants interviews for the government outreach position, an organizational outreach position for the coalition. We're also seeking representatives for the general global public outreach, student and youth outreach, business and faith-based communities outreach, and even regional representatives for the court. And we're hoping that if we get to these different sectors of society and raise the awareness that this potential court could exist, we hope to dramatically expand the coalition. So if anyone has any contacts for anyone who you think would be good to participate in any of those positions, are all volunteer positions at this point. I'm going to put our email address, so it's info@worldcourtofhumanrights.net. So please, that's in the chat. So please email us. Okay, well, so now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Melanie Nathan. Thank you so much for being here with us today. So Melanie Nathan is director of the African Human Rights Coalition, which provides humanitarian and advocacy services for the LGBTQI+ people in all phases of forced displacement. She's a country conditions expert witness testifying in the United States and globally for the LGBTQI+ asylum seekers from more than 20 African countries. She's an acclaimed and award-winning equality and human rights advocate and speaks on LGBTQ issues for the different LGBT communities around the world, with a focus on USA and Africa. She's a former Marin County, California Human Rights Commissioner, a former vice president on the board of the Bay Area Housing Advocates, and has served on several other boards, such as being elected president and participating as our vice president of the board of San Francisco Pride. And she's a former volunteer judge on the Marin Restorative Youth Court. I would like to say that World Service Authority, the organization of which I'm the executive director, besides providing documents of global identification and travel, we also have a legal advocacy team, which provides free advocacy, usually writing amicus legal briefs on behalf of refugees, stateless persons, and other people around the world. We do happen to be working on a case for a Ugandan man who fled Uganda seeking asylum in the U.S. due to seriously severe persecution that he suffered due to his sexual orientation. And Melanie Nathan was an expert witness on his initial case, in which he received withholding of deportation. We are now very glad that she is working with us to secure a permanent asylum status for him. So this is actually how Melanie and I first came in contact, and I'm really happy that she's here today, and sincerely appreciate you, Melanie, speaking with us today about your advocacy work and telling us the inspiring stories that you had mentioned to me just last week in a phone conversation about your advocacy work. So I'll hand it over to you, and I'll put myself on mute here.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Thank you. I wish I could say thank you to everybody individually, because I'm so appreciative of your work and you being here. I think there's a definite interesting nexus between what you're doing and some of the gaps and the holes that we've yet to see even have any hope toward. So there's a lot of hope given what you're doing. You know, before I get into my prepared remarks, the United States State Department's human rights reports came out a month late. They came out about a day or so ago. And in the Ugandan report, and I'm going to be using Uganda as an example in my discussion, I noticed that the United Nations, I'm reading from it, the government in Uganda did not cooperate with some UN specialized agencies that monitored human rights. On February the 3rd, the Ugandan government notified the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights it would not renew their mandate in the country. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated, this is like almost joke-worthy, stated the government had built sufficient human rights monitoring mechanisms, rendering the UN office, unnecessary. And media and human rights activists, it reads, alleged the government's decision was in retaliation for WCHR's criticism of the country's human rights record, especially in relation to reports of extrajudicial killings in the run-up to the 2021 election. So the WCHR, the UN Human Rights Commission office, closed its local office in Uganda in August of last year. And Uganda is probably one of the, when it comes to LGBT, is such an infractor, for want of a better word, and yet they feel like they're okay. And this really speaks to the challenges, which, we're obviously going to get to. But I want to start off by telling you about my neighbor's 9-year-old who walked past my house and said, "Hey, are you from Australia?" And I figured, well, he recognizes I don't quite have his accent, or maybe he's heard his parents speculate. And I responded, no, I'm from South Africa. And without even batting an eyelid, this kid said, "Well, why aren't you Black?" And, it was quite astute. And in that moment, as in many others through my decades-long journey, I'm always well equipped to justify my existence and my numerous intersecting identities. And I gave him the answer I'm going to give you. This is always an elephant in the room for me, so to speak. So I am the product of Jewish orphan pogrom refugees. All my grandparents forcibly fled Eastern European during the pogroms of the early 1900s. No other country would take them in. Canada, America were not interested. So by way of one example of my grandmother Rose, her mother, Fega Shamus, was faced with a Sophie's choice when a South African philanthropist by the name of Isaac Ochberg showed up from Cape Town saying he could take 2 of my great-grandmother's 12 children on a ship from the Ukraine area to South Africa. Imagine what that must have been like back then in the early 1900s. Knowing she would likely never see her kids again, she walked out of the room and told Mr. Ochberg, "You decide. I can't choose which of my children will live or die." And so my granny Rose, together with her Uncle Manny, her little brother, were shipped off to South Africa as very young children to be raised in the Johannesburg Jewish orphanage. And so I was born and raised into apartheid South Africa. I became an attorney and specialized in human rights law. And I left South Africa, I would say, under somewhat exile circumstances in 1985 and immigrated to the United States before the end of apartheid. I got very involved in equality-related work pertaining to the LGBT community in the United States, which ultimately led to all sorts of things happening back in Africa. And so I started working on LGBTQI-related stuff in different African countries and founded African Human Rights Coalition in 2014 as a formalization of the work I'd been doing for so many years. And so AHRC works with LGBT people forcibly displaced by criminalizing laws and societal taboos. Over 30 countries in Africa right now criminalize LGBT people, all a consequence of colonization and imperialism back starting in the 1800s and even before then. And those that did not criminalize still harbor taboos, mostly. There are very few countries in Africa that do not, have serious societal taboos. Even South Africa, who now has a fully equal constitution. In the constitution, it recognizes sexual orientation and gender identity as being fully equal. But even within those contexts, there's still taboos and systems that 20 years plus into the new constitution need a lot of work. And I have to say that I don't think South Africa would have such a constitution without the likes of someone like Madiba, Nelson Mandela, who said, when he insisted that sexuality and gender ID be included, he said, never, never again will South Africa be the skunk of the world. and he saw to it that that happened. So just to encapsulate, African Human Rights Coalition works with LGBT people at every aspect of the displacement cycle. We provide safe shelter, food, advocacy, referrals, legal work, all sorts of things, you name it. We do it on the continent and in other countries as well. In this work, I'm able to see the extent to which Africa's LGBT community is so significantly robbed of every aspect of their human rights. Every single aspect of their lives are impacted by these criminalizing laws and taboos. And that is a whole discussion in and of itself. There are now 110 million people generally in the world forcibly displaced due to a myriad of reasons: climate, war, ethnic related stuff, you name it. They are displaced. The LGBT community that is also displaced obviously forms a tiny, tiny fraction, but yet it's such a heightened, significant aspect because, you know, if one set of rights can go, what else? You know, it sets the stage. So the biggest issue facing LGBT people on the continent is obviously what I just said, but the biggest is, where do we go? Because the paths and pipelines, and I almost see this as an infraction on the other side of the river, so to speak, because what are we doing to ensure pipelines and pathways? If we have beliefs and systems where we say, look, this is a human right, and another country says this is not a human right, then we become it, and it is up to us to provide. So if we are not doing it to the maximum of our capability, we join join in complicity, because we're honestly capable. We really are capable of doing a lot more. You know, during the Trump era, the refugee numbers, because it's subject to presidential determination, that comes out every October. Trump gave 15,000 refugees. Obama was at about 125,000. Trump gave 15,000, and then actually 8,000 came in under the 15,000 determination. President Biden took it up back to 125. And I would say that I'm not at all happy with how President Biden has dealt with the southern border, because a lot could be different. I won't get into it now, but at least he's back to the 125. But Trump had so decimated the systems, and you know, so many nonprofits that did certain things didn't have funding anymore because of what went away, that for Biden to get back to where we were is going to be quite some work. So in this work, what I have noticed is the lack of, so we can't always point our finger until we also do our bit, because certain things just are never going to, or not for the longest time, get repaired on the other side of the river, so to speak. So we have to jump in. Just in the same way as Isaac Ochberg, by the way, my grandmother became what is known as an Ochberg orphan, and Ochberg orphans now have something like 3,000 descendants. So, you know, and there've been films made and all sorts of things, but the point is that we are all the Isaac Ochbergs. This is what should happen. So as LGBT community, if one is part of the LGBT community, or one is an ally and part of the human rights community, we have obligations, and that we must. So, you know, it's going to be interesting to look at the Human Rights Court and how it could fit into this ultimate picture. On the 31st of March, the Ugandan town of Entebbe brought together parliamentarians from all over Africa. For the first time, had the African Interparliamentary Conference on Family Values and Sovereignty. Notice that language. Sharon Slater from Family Watch International, a Mormon organization in the United States, working in tandem with the religious right, was present at that event. with Janet Museveni, the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni's wife. The Christian right-wing America has pumped in since 2007 over $55 million into their push to influence Africa to heighten its anti-homosexuality laws. They saw themselves losing ground in America, and Africa was fertile soil. And off they went and really did a good job of heightening the anti-homosexuality sentiment, which in essence serves as a recolonization or a post-colonization of already colonized countries. Because if you look at Uganda before the British showed up, and you look at, and I'm using Uganda as one example, but every single African country is similar. It was the British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Belgians, the Germans all went and colonized, and the French. And so at that time introduced their penal codes, many of which continue. Now, with the evangelicals coming along and saying, no, 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 it's not good enough to say against the order of nature, because that doesn't quite describe it, and that's difficult to prove in the courts. So let's call it what it is. Let's say homosexuality in our penal codes. And so they have been encouraging this new heightened law, such as you've just seen in Uganda and Ghana. Kenya's just introduced. And so this is the current trend, a surge in anti-homosexuality legislation. In Uganda last year, on the very day that Sharon Slater was in Entebbe, the parliament in Uganda passed what we have called the Kill the Gays Bill. And for certain things, it includes life imprisonment, long prison terms, and it also includes the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality. And as I speak to you right now, there are charges pending under that new law in Uganda right now. The activists in Uganda took the law to Constitutional Court, and on the 3rd of April of this year, the court upheld the law. It did knock out 3 clauses, none of which were that pertinent even to this discussion. Like, they weren't significant clauses, like, yeah, it would have been nice to see you knock out the kill the gays part, but they didn't. They upheld it. And now, just this last week, there's been a filing to the Supreme Court of Uganda. So we are on watch. But in the meantime, they are charging under this law. And what this caused was a mass evacuation of LGBTI people out of Uganda. And again, where do they go? Well, this is work that we're very involved in at African Human Rights Coalition. We actually help in relocating people. And let me tell you, I don't want to get into it right now because it's a huge discussion in and of itself, but it is a nightmare. It is an absolute nightmare. We literally, and I mean, what lawyer would sit on a recorded show and say, we helped people to skip bail? You know, but that was our human rights action. We were able to help 3 of the 6 known Jinja, Jinja 6, who were subject to a 4-month detention, subjected to what is considered torture by the UN, forced anal exams. This is what these people experienced. Well, we managed to get 3 of them out of the country. And I cannot even begin to tell you what that particular journey was like and where it's left things. And it's just a huge, big problem. And anybody that wants to talk more about that in the future, we can talk more about that. Just this year, Ghana passed its proper human sexual rights and Ghanaian family values bill. Smacks of evangelical just in that language. They passed that, and what that does is it takes it a step further where nobody has gone. What it has done is it makes the mere identification as LGBT or an ally a crime. So if I say I'm an open lesbian, just holding out, and that's the words they use in the legislation, hold out. If you hold out to be LGBTQI, and they have an extensive acronym, you have committed a crime. That means openly gay Tim Cook, who's CEO of Apple, who tells everybody that he's a gay man, there's an Apple store in Accra, Ghana. You know, if he shows up in Ghana, he's a criminal, he's a bank robber. And that's how he's viewed. And that is how people in Ghana will continue to be viewed. Now, I'm not sure if this is of too much interest, but I think it's important. Why, and it's a question that I get asked, why are we so interested in Africa? Like, why is Africa so important in this context? Well, for you, wanting to come up with a human rights court, there's a very easy answer to that. But I want to give you the answer that I give when I'm asked that question, and I'm asked it a lot, believe it or not. And I do think it speaks to when you bring things like World Court to people, it speaks to that. So my answer has been, well, and a lot of them are asking that question because I'm getting comments like, well, we have so many fish to fry, quote unquote, in the United States of America. Like, we forcibly displaced out of Texas, out of Florida, if you're a trans kid, even just with the aspect of choice and women's autonomy over their bodies. We have huge problems in America right now. Why is Africa so important? Firstly, subscribing to the philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because we are envelops the notion that all our houses must be in order for humanity to be in sync. A global connecting of all humanity. It is an ecology where if one thing is off kilter, everything tilts or collapses. And this could not be more profoundly felt than in the world of human rights. Imagine, we have a universal declaration of human rights that most countries subscribe to and yet do not adhere to. And often culture and sovereignty is used as an excuse, which taps into this philosophical quagmire. That is my one point about why Africa is so important. The next point, the global LGBT family is as much, and allies and human rights community, is as much important to LGBT people globally as Ochberg was to my great-grandmother and my grandmother. They are the only family, because in Africa, your own family rejects you. Another point, the African bloc in the UN is highly influential, as is the Middle East bloc, for example. So Africa bloc, together with Arab nations, have always stood in the way of important resolutions and mandates impacting LGBT people, which means if a resolution can't go through, it impacts America too. So that's another point. Then when it comes to things like financial aid, trade status, boycotts, you have got to know your stuff before you jump in and say, boycott, boycott, because maybe you're causing a backlash against the very groups. Maybe you're recolonizing in your approach. So having an understanding before you act is really important. And then the next point, HIV/AIDS. There is a global promise that it will be completely eradicated in 2030, or was it 2034? I forget. Imagine if you are driving people more underground than you ever have. How are you ever, and they're not getting services or seeking services, how are you ever going to eradicate? If you look at the Ginger Six in Uganda and their arrest, they were peer educators. They were teaching same-sex, male sex with male, how to use lubricants, how to use condoms, all those safety aspects. And that very aspect of how to have safe sex is construed in those criminalizing contexts as a promotion of homosexuality, which is criminalized. So remember that. And then the final point that I'll bring up, and there are probably a million more of why we should be interested in Africa, is our own accountability. I've said a little bit about that before, but also if our evangelicals are recolonizing, we are accountable. What are we doing here? Where are the affirming Christian churches? What are they doing? Because so much of this is done on the basis of so-called faith. You know, these are faith-based organizations taking homophobia to Africa. And that is an important point to note in this context as well, because the current prevailing narrative on the continent of Africa and in most of these countries is that homosexuality is un-African. Now, imagine that. To say homosexuality is un-African is to say I don't have red bloods running through my vein, I'm a different human being, because of how we understand human sexuality. And we'll come back to that in a second. So what you have here is not what the prevailing narrative is. It's actually homophobia that is being exported to Africa by our evangelicals, not homosexuality. But in Africa, they're saying it's homosexuality. You're bringing us your homosexuals and your homosexual rights. It doesn't apply to us. And so this is a very critical aspect, because when it comes to something like criminal court and having countries assent, and I just read you in the beginning the example of what Uganda has done with the Office of Human Rights. They think they have enough monitoring systems, and yet they've got 9/10 of their Ugandan LGBT community being beaten up by mobs and vigilantes, and there's corrective rape of their lesbians, and there's blackmail by their police, and there's unlawful detentions and their disappearances and their killings, but they have it under control, you know? So now I just want to make this point. One has an absolute right to one's sexuality, whether innate, which is the prevailing understanding here in our country, that your sexuality and your gender identity is innate, or a choice. Now, that is not popular belief, because saying being LGBTI is a choice gives license to those criminalizing laws. But as human rights lawyers and as human rights people, even if you had a choice, why should your choice, even if that was a prevailing notion, which it's not, but there should be a choice. You should have a right to your choice. But the fact that it's innate and surely means that human sexuality and how your body responds to attraction is a very private part of one's life, and hence a very basic human right. Yet countries like Uganda, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and I sit in the courts, I give testimony for over 20 African countries right now. Those rights in those countries do not, those individual rights, do not supersede the interests of community as perceived by those countries. What is the interests of communities when it comes to LGBT people? The community's interest is, if you're a homosexual, if you're a lesbian, if you're a trans person, you are not comporting with what is binary and what is expected of by our culture of you. And so you are going against our culture, and you are an abomination, you are satanic, and you are hurting our society. You are hurting our community, and we cannot have that. And so this is where the big, big question comes, and the big, big struggle comes. The question being sovereignty. How do you take a country's sovereignty, their sovereign right to make a law, and say, no, you cannot do that. Because when you entrench a law, you are telling your community, we're protecting you, this is for you, and this is right. In a country like Uganda, in a country like Kenya, in a country like Ghana, if you check out on the Afrobarometer, which is a way of collecting data and taking surveys and all that stuff, if you check out on the Afrobarometer, you will see most of these countries have over 90% of their population saying that I could not tolerate living next door to a homosexual. That's how high it is. And you know what? The politicians know it. And the religious people push it. So there is this symbiotic relationship between the religious people in these countries, which are highly religious countries, whether it's Muslim or Christian religions. These religious people influence the voters. And so the politicians have taken these causes and formed these symbiotic relationships. And a perfect example of how that works is a country like Nigeria, where you have the Christian South and the Muslim North. What better way for a past president, for example, I'm just throwing out his name, Jonathan Goodluck, to get elected, because he was the one who passed the newest anti-gay Nigerian law. So if Jonathan Goodluck can go to the South and the North and say, hey, listen, we're agreed on this issue, it's aligning and it's unifying and it brings what it brings. You know, you get a country like Mauritania. Mauritania is the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. They have taken Sharia law when it comes to homosexuality and incorporated the actual Sharia law into their criminal code. And so there is the death penalty for gay people in Mauritania. So imagine a country like Mauritania subscribing to a world court. And this is probably one of the countries where, from our perspective, we would need it most. So for me, my biggest interest is how do you get people to assent to these treaties that make them, a participant, and especially in light of the fact that they're letting go of some of the UN things and agencies. They don't even follow them where it doesn't suit them, so there's always this big problem that I see when it comes to getting these kind of countries on board. So my question would be, how do you motivate them? It would be really good, I think, if aid were tied into like if there were incentives, it would take so much diplomacy because, when Kamala Harris, vice president, went to visit Ghana, and when President Obama, during his period, went to Kenya, the first thing that happens behind the scene is, don't talk about homosexuality. It's like, don't bring it up, and there's so many competing factors. And I do think that Africa is more empowered than it ever was to give the finger to America on so many levels because of China and Russia and how they present now in those countries where they never had a foothold, a century ago, for example. So there is that aspect of the motivation. But I want to bring up something really quick. How are we doing on time? Okay. I want to bring up something quick and I'm really throwing this all at you very quickly because each and every aspect of anything I've mentioned is a long story in and of itself. But the one thing I want to mention is I had a lovely discussion with David. I really enjoyed it. And this stuff sort of came up. And I explained to David, he said, yeah, bring it up. How important I think benchmarks and setting goals are. Because without a benchmark, we have no future to look to. We have nothing. And I want to give two examples of things that I have done in my career as, doing this work, where people have said to me, Melanie, that is impossible. You're wasting your time. And I set the goal. And I was probably, if I would have, I often wonder if I would have been as old and as wise as I am now, and this is a cautionary tale, if I would have been as old and as wise as I am now, I might not have attempted those things. And I might have been more inclined to listen to my elders. You can't do that. That's not possible. Why would you even try that? And I had that young revolutionary in me that just said, okay, this is what I want. It was that benchmark, that goal. And the one example was very early in my career in South Africa. I was 23 when I passed my bar exam, and I was given a case where, during apartheid, where two young Zulu men were sitting on death row. And I had started my own law practice because nobody really wanted to hire a young woman to be a lawyer. So I just, in their practice. And so I started my own law practice. And the way I saw getting work was to go to other law firms and to say, give me what you don't want. And that's how I got work. So on one such assignment, I was told to go down to Pretoria Central Prison and to tell two young Zulu men, this was Thursday, that they're going to hang on Monday morning. And that the plea for clemency had been turned down by the state president. So, going to get paid $40 or whatever it was back then. This was in the 80s. And I went down to Pretoria Central Prison, and the guards there did not believe that I was really a lawyer because I didn't look like one. And certainly in that country at that time, long story short, get to meet the guys. I meet the first guy, and my only job is to say, you are going to hang on Monday morning. I'm so sorry. And for some reason, something kicked in. It was my newish law school mind, because I remembered from law school, they said to me, well, and by the way, I knew nothing about this case. I didn't even know why they were there. And I was delivering a message. But anyway, I just said, look, can you tell me something that you haven't told anybody in all this time you've been sitting on death row? Can you tell me something new that's the truth that you've never told anyone for whatever reason? Because I thought in my head, I knew in South African law that if there were mitigating, not extenuating circumstances, it takes away the death penalty. But I also knew procedurally that we were at the end of the road here. So the first guy I met with said, well, actually, I've never told anyone this. This is all done through a Zulu interpreter, but I committed the crime. I murdered this woman. It was a witchcraft related thing. I believed she was killing people in the villages with her in the village with her witchcraft, and blah, blah, blah. And I killed her. But the guy who's going to hang with me on Monday morning didn't do it. And he named the other party. And so immediately I'm like, oh my God, there's an innocent man. And I ran back to the law firm, cutting a lot of stuff short. And the lawyers at the law firm said to me, what are you worried about? Laat die kaffer moet hang. Let the N-word hang. Remember, I'm in apartheid South Africa, and this is what I was dealing with. And I thought to myself, well, how do I do that? And so I said, can I take over the case? And they said yes. Cutting a lot of complication, a long story short, I did. And we got into court on an emergency basis that Friday evening in front of a family law judge. And the judge said the government opposed it and said, no, they must still hang on Monday, and relied on some law that you can't rely on the confession of a dying man. I'm oversimplifying, and threw us out of court. And it was in that moment that I thought to myself, this is someone's life, and I know that I was so convinced of his innocence because I interviewed him too. And I said to him, tell me something. I said exactly like I said to the other bloke, tell me something you have never told anybody, that you committed the crime, that you were drunk. And he said, no, I'm innocent. And I looked into that man's eyes and I knew it. And, that Sunday afternoon, his old 80-year-old mother, or however old she was, or grandmother came on a train 1,000 miles to bid him farewell. But what I had done was I went to through a realm that lawyers in South Africa never take. You don't call the press, but I did. And then you don't And I got the parliamentarians involved as well. There was a woman by the name of Helen Suzman, who was a progressive leader of the opposition party. And I said, look, this man, I want the Minister of Justice to know that there is an innocent man, and I want the state president who turned down the plea for clemency to know. A lot of stuff happened, including getting it in the press in that 48-hour period. But I was told that by everybody I spoke to along the way, there is nothing you can do. It is over. Go home. Have a nice weekend. And I just plowed away intuitively at whatever I could do that felt like something. On 4 hours before the scheduled hanging, both men were pulled out of death row. It had made it to the press. It had made it to the parliamentarians. I had said it's a racial thing because I really believe that if these were white men, you would be thinking, okay, let's spend 3 weeks looking for the real culprit. Somehow we'll make this happen. But you just don't care because it's a black guy in apartheid South Africa, and long story. Anyway, that's what happened. So my point is, I want to bring one more story to you, anecdotally, because this brings it to America. In America, in 2009, long history behind this, there was a lesbian mom who had been detained by ICE. She'd been in America for 14 years, something like that. She really thought that she had got asylum. She really thought that her case for asylum was over, that she had asylum. She was living with her partner, and together they had twin sons who at that point were 12 years of age. They had had the babies by fertilizing the eggs of one mother and the other mother carrying. And so it was, medically done, but you couldn't, between a lesbian couple, have more of two mommy family than these two. The one was an American citizen, and we had no marriage equality at the time. And this was 2009. And also we had no marriage equality for the purposes of immigration. So there was no federal marriage. And so I showed up, knocked on her front door, and said, basically arrested her, detained her, and she was about to be deported when I got this case. Long story short, I went to Congresswoman Jackie Speer and I went to Senator Dianne Feinstein, and I asked Dianne Feinstein to introduce a private bill into Congress for Shirley Tan. I went I'm an individual advocate at this point. I don't have African Human Rights Coalition. I went to Human Rights Campaign. I went to the Gay and Lesbian Task Force. I went to Immigration Equality. I went to all the prominent LGBT organizations and others. And I said, will you join me in asking Senator Feinstein? Will you help me? And they all laughed at me. They said, Senator Feinstein will never do it. You're wasting your time. I said, can we set the benchmark? Have you ever tried this? There are nuances about this case that I know that I could deliver to the senator. And at this point, I had a good relationship with the senator's office because I had done other stuff with them. Long story short, made the leveraged press, Congresswoman Speer, Senator Feinstein, and everybody that told me it was not possible ran to enjoy the fruits for their publicity when Senator Feinstein walked into Congress on April, I think it was 23rd, good God, it's the anniversary, 2009, and introduced a private bill into Congress for Shirley Tan, setting the benchmark, setting the goal, being told it's impossible, you cannot do it. That is the biggest part of the message that I want to bring here today. Don't be told you can't do it, even by me, when I'm worried that is Uganda going to assent to this? We need, you know what I'm saying? So please don't give up. Keep doing what you're doing, and just set that goal and follow that naivety. There's nothing more precious than naivety, because it really, really taps into the impossible. And that is what I have to say. I'm open to any questions you might have and a discussion.
Well, Melanie, thank you for these words of encouragement. we sincerely appreciate it. We have, Mark and I have been working on this, and the coalition we've been building over the last 10 to 12 years. We do get pushback from individuals saying, this isn't ever going to happen, so why continue? But of course, we need to continue to support the many people around the world who are currently suffering from human rights violations, and especially in parts of the world where there's not even a regional human rights system like in Asia. Well, so thank you so much. I guess I'll start off with a question, and then if anyone wants to raise your physical or cyber hand, I'll call on you. But I guess I would say, what are your concerns as well as positive thoughts about the creation of a World Court of Human Rights and how that would intersect with your LGBTQI plus advocacy? Do you see the positives of it, the difficulties with it?
So there's so many realms to the value of such a thing, because first and foremost, it brings attention. So if there is a human rights scenario happening, an injustice or a reason, I would like to see the kind of court that would bring to light, these are the countries that are involved and these are the countries that refuse to get involved. So even at that level, you can elucidate the need, the ongoing need for why certain countries need to come in. And so what you're really doing is you're staging and you're platforming issues that come to world attention. And that in and of itself can influence change within the realms of those countries, and can help towards building coalitions. So I think that even if you're not fully accomplishing your mission, you have value. And I think that's really important to recognize. The problem I do see is the worst offenders are not going to join. And when the worst offenders do join, they're going to not adhere. We see it right in front of our faces right now. However, I still think, for same reason, that this is really, really important. And I do believe that you're giving human rights defenders within those countries something to hold on to, which is really important. So when a human rights defender, such as, say, in Uganda, walks or tries to walk into a parliamentarian's office, they're going to have more material than if your court didn't exist, because they can, bring forward examples and say, look, this is what's happening. A perfect example is when Ghana was looking to, when people were sending in briefs to the parliamentary committee before Ghana just passed its new anti-homosexuality legislation, my organization sent in a brief. But I said, okay, look, we're not going to, even though we have ambassadors and an office in Kenya, and we have ambassadors for our organization in different countries, we're still that white Western organization that really will be perceived as a post-colonizer if we try and tell you what to do. So I said, I'm not going to present a brief telling Ghana Parliament what's wrong. What I am going to do is I'm going to tell the Ghanaian Parliament that I do give country conditions reporting in the American and global courts for Ghanaian asylum seekers, and this is the stories they are bringing to me. Those Ghanaian asylum seekers are unable to tell their stories themselves to their own parliament, but I can tell that story. So that's what I did. I said, this is what your people are coming to my country and saying. And I think that there's value in that. And you can sort of see the parallel right there with that and the idea of a court. The one thing that I think is so tragically missing among so many other tragically missing things for LGBTQI and possibly other human rights candidates is the aspect not so much of holding people, well, certainly holding people accountable at a criminal law level, but also from a civil law level, because I don't see compensation for that gay person that had to literally run in flight in a single second and has left behind a legacy, has left behind family property, has left behind all sorts of things, and has suffered such terrible abuse that should, on some civil, I mean, we've got a guy right now. I met with him yesterday, actually, for the first time. He's Zambian. I'll give you his name because it's not confidential. It's so public. And I am coming out with a big fundraiser for him. And I never do fundraisers for individuals, ever. It's a rule. But I'm changing it for him. His name is Stephen Sambo. He was convicted in Zambia and sentenced to 15 years because of being gay. He was caught with his partner and they both received that sentence. In 2021, when it was African Freedom Day, a whole lot of people were commuted, sentences were commuted, including his, and he'd served 3 years. And so he was released. He's now living, this man cried to me on the phone yesterday. I mean, on Zoom. I met with him on Zoom. He was crying. He said, ever since I've been out of jail, I have not been able to leave my house because my case was so public. He's still criminalized in his own country. He has nowhere to go. There's no country that's going to take him in because there's no such thing as an asylum visa, which means that he has to cross a border into an equally punishing country where he is still like jumping from the fire into the frying pan. If he goes across a border, he will be seeking UNHCR protection like a political escapee, right? Or person fleeing. But he does not, but he has to tell the truth. So he has to say, I'm here because I'm LGBT, I belong to that social group, and I need protection. And that government will refuse to register him. And UNHCR needs the governments to register people because that is how this all works. And so, I mean, I'm cutting a long story short. It's very complex. This is things we do advocacy for, and we actually do manage to get people registered. But someone like him, he cannot leave Zambia. There's nowhere for him to go. He's stuck in a room with an 84-year-old grandmother who is been trying to support him, but no longer can. And she agreed to accept him, even given her, I mean, he's lucky that he has, because most won't. So even being family. So, you know, this guy is caught in this situation where he cannot get work. There's no way. He will be killed if he's seen anywhere. So this is this is an Anne Frank, you know, and what's happening in Africa is genocidal. You know, President Museveni, when he signed that bill, he called on all African leaders to save the world from homosexuality. That is genocidal. And this is what we're dealing with. So someone like him, pathway, civil remedies, and accountability by perpetrators, because even if you are persecuting someone, even if you are criminalized in your own country, you still do not have the expectation that you're going to be beaten by a mob or subjected to so-called vigilante justice, which is rife in many African countries. Vigilantes are considered an important part of society and are actually it's actually kind of an interesting way that navigation because of how they're perceived as being helpful to society on the one hand, but yet they are committing crimes on the other, you know, and that is another whole aspect of what is a human right or not, you know, and it does bring to mind that what are the repercussions? What is the accountability? It doesn't exist nearly enough for what people are going through. And unfortunately, repercussions really are necessary to curb. You know, if we didn't need repercussions, we wouldn't need to have the rule of law. And so, you know, this is where we are. I hope I answered you, David.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. Thank you for sharing that specific example because that helps us to clarify how this is, you know, rights violations are impacting individuals' lives in such a severe way. Yeah, no, thank you. Mark has a question for you.
No, first of all, comment. So thank you so much for your fascinating remarks. You know, you've said a lot of things. I think you're preaching to the choir in many respects. When you began, as I understood it, you talked about a constitutional amendment for the nation-state constitution in South Africa that sounded like a pretty helpful step. And that sort of made my mind go to imagining a case arising out of South Africa coming before a World Court of Human Rights, where the law to be applied could be inter alia, the provision of the South African law. Let's assume that the class or the plaintiff was involved in an LGBTQ issue. So you've got the South African constitutional provision. I would assume that there are elements of the human rights, regional human rights provisions that are specific to Africa that could be cited. I'm very sympathetic to all the ideas of, the limited enforceability. I also am fond of quoting the chief judge of Guyana, a gentleman named Karl Ashok Singh, who notably said that just because something is not 100% enforceable doesn't mean it's worthless. And I think that, fighting the good fight and, as you say, giving people in these difficult positions hope and giving them a voice and giving them a toehold essentially in this climb are very worthwhile. And I'm wondering, my question is, would South Africa be willing to give up as much of its, a tiny bit of its sovereignty, as I think it was Nehru said at some point, in furtherance of the greater good? And when we think about international law versus world law, world law is this kind of utopian thing, maybe not during my lifetime. But I think to the extent that there really is just intrinsically world law, it would have to be insofar as humans have common characteristics. And when we talk about the right of liberty and the right to be free from slavery and the right to food and basic health care and so on, we are talking about matters that appropriately fit into the concept of world law. So do you think you could get South Africa on board and we can go together when David's grounds passes come through and advocate at the UN?
I love that question. And there is an answer that I think is sort of dichotomous on some level, because you have to contextualize and look at the history with South Africa. South Africa, with that very constitution, sent Kwelani, who is since deceased, as the South African ambassador to Uganda around 2014. At the time, Uganda was passing the first Kill the Gays bill that got squished by the courts. Kwelani was at the time before the South African Constitutional Court, and I don't know if it was the Constitution, he was in front of the South African courts, accused under the crime in South Africa of hate speech. Hate speech in South Africa is a crime. And the hate speech was homophobic. And yet South Africa sent him as the ambassador to Uganda, which at the time was known to be implementing this law then in 2014. That was the sensitivity. That's number one. We were outraged by it. Number two, South Africa should be that country because of that one and only equality-based constitution, should be the country that is saying to the Ugandans and the Ghanaians, because let's face facts, this solution must be an African solution, which is what you bring up, because anything other than that is colonizing. And so a South African leader can say, wait a minute, this is not un-African, and they can have that discussion, but they're not doing it. They are not doing it. So whether they are not doing it because they don't believe it, or it doesn't suit their diplomatic relations, and I'm sure there's a lot of complexities. They're all helping each other with regard to terrorism and infiltration of that, where they really need each other. So the LGBT issue is not as important. But South Africa should be saying, fix this. This is not right. And they're not saying a thing. And the South Africans should also be saying, hey, any of you who are forcibly displaced, come here. We will create safe shelter for you, because what's happening to you is not okay. South Africa is one of the harder countries for me to get people into. And I do try, and I have got many into South Africa. And once they get into South Africa, I'll square with you. that 3 of the Ginger 6 are in South Africa right now. And yes, thank God they're there, because there's a myriad of protections we can apply once we get them in, but getting them in is hard. But here's the problem. South African Home Affairs Office is so defunct and so useless and so corrupt that they are not registering people. And I've had to pay $75 like 12 times, I kid you not, for these 3 young men to show up at Home Affairs to be sent away. We can't do it today because we can't. You know what I can do with those $75 in terms of feeding people that we're trying to feed? You know what I mean? And so, to be honest, I love the question because it elucidates just how useless South Africa is. However, South Africa's in an election year, and this election year may do something different compared to past years. Let's wait and see. But there is the South African minority in Parliament, the DA, and there is a young parliamentarian. God, why is he's a friend and he's jumping me, but I would go to the other party, or let's look and see if they form a coalition government. That may happen for the first time. But so things could change in South Africa, but I'm not discouraging you. I think you need to know what you're dealing with. And I think going to South Africa might be a good idea, because you're testing the consciousness, and and it may well be a way in. It might be. So I'm not discouraging you, and I think forming some kind of internal coalition between different political factions would be a good idea, and bringing it to them on the basis of so much else. But South Africa has a big xenophobia problem, huge, right now. I mean, it's causing rioting on the streets. And so, that's worth considering. David, did you have a follow-up? I mean, Mark, sorry.
Just very quickly. Number one, we work through with an organization that sort of supports the Nobel Peace Laureates, of which, of course, Nelson Mandela was one in 1993. He died in 2013. And so I'm wondering whether his family might still have individuals who are pursuing his types of goals. And Jonathan Granoff at the Global Security Institute in New York is a big proponent, I would like to say, of ours. And he's the guy who curates the Nobel Peace Laureates. So that's one thought. The second thought, and I think that the World Court of Human Rights Coalition and the Peace Laureates need to make common cause. I think Jonathan would agree with that. They're a very busy bunch of people, but I think that there's potential mining opportunity there. The other point I should make is that a former, I believe, president of South Africa, I believe his first name is Jacob, was in attendance in Lucknow at the Chief Justice Conference. And he may be somebody, and I may have the name wrong, but I can find it and I can forward it to you. He was in attendance repeatedly at the 3 Chief Justice meetings that I attended, and a very, very strong advocate, as were they all the Chief Justices, for a World Court of Human Rights. So I'm heartened by the possibility of a South African involvement. Thank you.
So there would be other people to contact other than who you've mentioned that I would be happy to give you the names of. One is the Helen Suzman organization. I forget what they call themselves now, but they are more progressive on these issues than anyone else, even more than the Mandela Foundation. The Mandela Foundation recently went through a corruption scandal, or some kind of a scandal, with its lead person who was expelled, and they are recently looking for new leadership. And the person running that organization has been an interim person. I don't believe any of Mandela's children are very into this particular topic, but if you're looking for LGBT sort of legacy, so to speak, Bishop Tutu's daughter is open lesbian. She might live in the UK or South Africa, I'm not sure. She recently married her same-sex partner. She would be a good person and he's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Funnily enough, I worked with the Nobel Peace Prize Institute myself for years because I represented the South African Gold Coin Exchange, who had the worldwide rights to all the Nobel laureates on gold coins. And I did a lot of PR work for them in tandem with the Nobel Institute, who had given them the rights. I haven't worked for them in several years, but this is an interesting connection. So the president you might be referring to is Jacob Zuma. Zuma is himself in legal quagmire in terms of his own criminality. He was up on rape charges, and he's still being, I think he served time, and he's still being raked over some coals, but he still keeps coming back. I haven't been following where things are at with him, but I don't know that he would be somebody that I would involve in something like this. I think if you wanted to involve South Africa, the thing to do would be to form a coalition of interested parties, and that would contain parliamentarians, civil societies, like some kind of a task team of sorts. Might be very helpful with with a decent amount of influence. And so, putting together something like that, which is kind of what we did with the issue of so-called corrective rape. We managed to get the South African parliamentarian, the Minister of Justice, the Department of Justice, and the South African police and civil society into a coalition of what we called a task team, to have meetings every 3 months or whatever to investigate and pursue and, set goals and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I think that it's doable, and I think South Africa could be an important ally. I think
Rosalind, has a question.
Okay, thank you so much, Melanie, for the presentation. Mine is not a question per se, but just confirming on the reaction. In fact, when I saw the invite for this meeting, I can agree with her. I was just jittery. I was asking myself, what are we discussing about LGBTQ? But it was very insightful as a leader in my country. It's more of eye-opening. And the question that I had, and you answered along the way, it's whether you are incorporating ambassadors from the local African countries. Because, for example, me, I come from Kenya. If you can all remember last year, sometime in February, there's a court ruling that was made that all the people that are homosexuals or they belong to the LGBTQ, they should be recognized, and it stirred a lot of reactions from the politicians to the church leaders to the entire community. It was all over in the social networks, and people were really criticizing. So I think it's true. There's a long way to go as we approach the African countries because of the Ubuntu. Most of us, we live in the communal virtues and values are integrated in us, and anything that is against it seems like it's more of like now a colonial era. And then, from even the colonization that happened some years ago, these people are to believe the whites. For example, Melanie, I can say she's a South African. So she's a South African. She has been in South Africa for long. But when she's advocating for these rights, you'll find that people will view her as a white person rather than an African. And yet, maybe all her life or majority of her life she has spent with the Africans. So it is very nice. I just wanted to say maybe you add ambassadors from the countries that you're targeting, but you answered that. You said that you have ambassadors in these African countries, of which is very key. And then on the whatever Mark was asking, I think she has equally answered well, that because of the sovereignty of these countries and the regional blocks, and there's what mandates as like there's that community, like us, for example, in Kenya, we have the East African community. You find that we won't want to go outside of our regional bloc. Even if maybe other countries, maybe like in the southern part, they agree, or the West Africans, they agree, there is what you want to do that will relate with your neighbors. So as she was speaking on this issue, it was close home. And yeah, it's good to note that even for the World Court of Human Rights to go through, it's very important that we consider the lawmakers and also we consider the politicians. They are very key, and also the religious education. Because in Africa, apparently there's a lot of religion, and we tend to believe whatever we get from our religious leaders, that is like the truth. So Melanie, thank you so much for highlighting this. Yeah, it was a very good discussion. And I've got something that I can even write about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosalind. I really appreciate that. I want to add something to what Rosalind just said. I learned, I think this is important to note. I learned my biggest lesson from a Ugandan parliamentarian as a white person, even though I was steeped in understanding Africa culturally differently to how my white counterparts in America understand Africa. I was raised by a Xhosa nanny, and my mother is buried in the tribal chief graveyard of the Tswana people. They honored her to bury her in the only white woman, Jewish woman, buried with the royal chiefs of the Tswana people in Motswedi. So my family is very steeped in African culture, even though quite rightly noticed by Rosalind that I would never be recognized in that way, understandably, and I certainly am not here to appropriate anything. But I learned something more recently by a Ugandan parliamentarian by the name of Honorable Nabila Simpala. Honorable Nabila was the women's parliamentary person for Women's Kampala representative, is what her title was. And they had all just signed the old Kill the Gays bill. And I heard that she was the one holdout. Now, she purposely didn't show up to Parliament that day, but they tried to get her to sign a paper saying if the bill was brought back, she would sign for the bill. She was under extreme physical threat if she did not sign that piece of paper, which she did with some caveats attached to it. She said when she signed it, if you want me to sign this, then you have to apply the anti-sodomy laws to heterosexual people as much as you do to gay people. And so she stood out. So I invited her to San Francisco, where I was living at the time. And I said, Honorable, come and tell people on the San Francisco LGBT community why you're in this situation, why it is so hard for even one person, one parliamentarian to stand out that way. And she came, she accepted my invitation. I had her meet with openly gay State Senator Mark Leno. I had her meet with the Women's and the Human Rights Commission in San Francisco. I took her to a lesbian wedding at San Francisco City Hall. And I took her to the Castro where all the gays hang out, and she saw men holding hands and eating ice cream together and whatever everybody does, okay? She taught me one of my biggest lessons. She taught me how to actually view things a little bit differently. She said to me, Melanie, she said, thank you for bringing me here because there's one thing I never realized. She said, I've always thought that homosexuality is about the act, about the sex act. But what I never realized, it never came to me, she said, is that it's really about companionship and people being together, loving each other. She said, I saw the love in those eyes of those two women getting married. And it changed everything for me because I realized that they one day will be sipping their tea on a patio, on a stoop together, and they will be companions for the rest of their lives. That is what that is. And what's wrong, and what changed for me was never ever to point the finger in the face of an African again and say, you naughty, naughty homophobe. What is missing is the understanding and the cultural accommodations whereby people can start to work to try and understand better where each other are coming from. In other words, because only that will ultimately bring the change, you know, and establishing the relationships, seeing, I mean, in America, the only way people got equality in America was when they started to come out. And when they started to have other people realize that their son, their daughter, and their best friend might be gay, you know, and it brought a different understanding. Now, in the African context, it's not quite safe to do that right now. And it's a whole other environment, but I really, really, really believe that it can start, and Rosalind just helped me remember this, that it can start with cultural exchanges where you don't shove people's faces in stuff and you don't even try and influence them. You just say, come and see what we're doing. You know, that's all. And so this is something that my organization's been looking to do more. We don't have funding, but if we had funding, this is the kind of thing we would be doing.
Thank you, Melanie. Does anyone else have any questions? We are a little almost 25 minutes over the hour. Oh, Drea, please.
Hi, sorry, I want to, it's not a question, but more of a comment. Because what you were saying, Melanie, really regarding the money that's being from the religious and the alt-right in the United States towards African countries for this agenda. Unfortunately, I'm coming from a smaller community in Canada, and they're doing the same. And I live in a green, queer immigrant community that is just full of love and community, and we are under attack because millions are being spent here to push, and because LGBTQ rights are protected on a federal level, women's rights are protected on a federal level, and I do not know where this country will be in 5 years. And I do not know if those rights will still be in place. And I do not know what this community will look like in 5 years. We get death threats, we get protests because of how our community is, and we are under attack on a daily basis. And that's why I really want to say, like, this coalition is so critical, because what do I do as a Canadian when those rights are taken away from me? And the reality is, more and more, it's looking like they will.
Yeah.
And that's where I see this coalition as so critical. What else do we have to utilize to protect our community, our queer community, our immigrant community, and women's rights? And it's all intertwined. So I just want to say thank you so much for this today. This has just been eye-opening, and really, I really appreciate everything you're saying today.
You know, thank you so much. If I can just respond real quick to that, because I think this is a serious alert. What you say, I see happening. We're all in tandem with this fragility that, and look at America with Roe v. Wade, and you know, all of the stuff. What is most horrific to me, and would be counter to what you're trying to do with World Court, is this Project 2025 that the religious right in America has come out with, 825 pages of what they intend to do. And what is so, and this is to, am I pronouncing your name correct, Drea? Is that right? This speaks to you, Drea, too, even though you're in Canada. This, because it will impact you. You know, America's a leader. So this particular thing is what the religious right used to do in secret. They used to do all of this in secret. They used to have these little meetings, and a whole lot of people used to come, and they used to make these manifestos. Now they're publishing it. This has all been emboldened since the Trump era, you know, because now people are emboldened and they can come out with their hate in a different way. And what is so terrifying about this is the emboldenment, for a start, that they have the audacity to put in writing what they plan to do. And it covers every single aspect of all of our freedoms. It places the rule of law, democracy, everything at stake. And we are turning on a dime right now. And this is what really scares me, and even more so amongst the progressive left, which I, to some extent, used to identify with, but are now having a hard time with, because I see democracy as so fragile, and I see our choices as so limited when it comes to voting and all that kind of thing. But we have to be prudent, and our being prudent doesn't mean we don't still hold people's feet to the fire. But what it does bring for me, and things that I talk a lot at colleges and to students, and something I'm now telling students is, I'm saying, look, I can't influence your vote. You got to vote for whoever you want to vote for. But number one, vote. And number two, know that you will never get, and I hate to say this, especially as a benchmarker, but right now you will never get more. If you like, you'll be lucky to get 70% of what you want out of a candidate, and 30% of what the candidate's offering you're going to hate. But there's no other basis. The thing we do wrong is when we do get in, who we get into our various, we don't, that is when we really need to hold their feet to the fire, but we don't. And that is the important thing. That's when you go in for your other 30%. You know what I mean? So this is what we're facing right now. We're facing a very, very, very daunting, scary year where all of this could turn on a dime, and our rights are at extreme risk. The makeup of the US court has to change. And then again, it makes the case for a human rights court, because here we are in our ivory towers in countries like Canada and the US, holier than thou, Mr. Other Country or Mrs. Other Country, you know, and we need those checks as well.
Thank you, Melanie. Any other final quick comments or questions? I mean, I have a lot of questions, but so maybe we have another one of these conversations in a few months from now that we can get to those questions, because I wanted to ask you about something from the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, but since it's already almost 12:30, I feel like you've done an amazing job of covering this aspect of intersectionality and respect for human rights for everyone. So thank you so much. Did you have any other final comments, though, for us, Melanie, before we leave for today's meeting about coalition building, or about this, how we can work together to advance human rights of LGBTQI plus community, as well as humanity and the earth overall?
Well, let me say this. First of all, I can't thank you enough, because it's been an absolute pleasure meeting all of you. I love the questions. I would like to get a million more questions. So, I'm open to anything in the future. I'm also very excited to work with you on that particular case that we're working on. So I'm grateful, very grateful for that. I would invite everybody to take a look at our website and also at my work. There might be some things about my work that you don't like, and that's fine, but hopefully the parts of my work that you do like supersede the parts of my work that you don't like. That said, I just want to really say thank you, and especially to you, David, for the very kind invitation. And, I'm open to wherever this leads, and also to direct communication from anybody who wants to be in touch. I am going in for a big surgery next month. So I'm having part of my spine fused. So I'm going to be out for most of June. But beyond that, hopefully I'll be on the road to a good recovery and more than available.
Excellent. Wow. Melanie, thanks again for your time that you gave us today. And as Drea mentioned in the comments, we do need a part 2 of our conversation here in a few months. And I did put africanhrc.org in the comments if anyone would like to go see more about what your coalition is doing. Do you have a particular email that you would like to share publicly here to let everybody know how to reach out to you?
Yeah, should I put it in the chat for
Yeah,
you?
that would be great. And I can, if it's okay, I'll read that out once you put it in.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 2 addresses.
Okay.
And so Commissioner M. Nathan, hang on, Commissioner my eyes. Commissioner M. Nathan. So Commissioner M. Nathan at gmail.com is my favorite address. But if that's too much to get down, Nathan at africanhrc.org is also addressed, and you'll probably get a response from the commissioner address. Yeah. And also, just to let people know that I am available for briefings, depending on the nature of your work. I am available for briefings, like I like to give corporate briefings about this. And obviously all my talks are tailored to whatever, is the organization. I'm also available to give talks when it comes to celebrating Pride, although this June I will be out. And, any congregations or corporations or law firms that want to hear any of this, I'm happy to receive an invitation.
That would be amazing. And I can already think of our students in our World Citizen Clubs or our collegial organizations, along with World Service Authority. We're working with the Citizens for Global Solutions and the World Federalist Movement to advance World Federation, but universal rights, environmental rights. So certainly I'm sure that there will be opportunities for you to share this important information with a lot of other groups and individuals around the world that we collaborate with. So thank you again, Melanie, so much for your time today. I sincerely appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you about our case that we've talked about very soon. And definitely before June.
Yes, definitely before June.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.